The Red Web, Chapter 10, The Hunted. It was dark. Always dark. It had been dark for months. The darkness was maddening, piercing, all-encompassing. At first, they had burned whatever they could find for light. The torches made them visible, made them targets, and soon the things that they could burn started to run out. There was the occasional glow globe, of course, but with no reliable source of power, they wouldn't last long. What fuel was left was saved for cooking, and even then the smoke choked their lungs and depleted precious oxygen, while leading their enemies to them. So they grew to live in the dark, to eat the food cold and raw. A small stash of batteries kept on hand for emergencies. No light, just darkness. The dark drove many of the sad souls trapped in the catacombs under the Perklon dome of Hive Minerva mad. The lack of sensory input and constant threat of thieves and murderers was too much, and so these ones became deranged, hallucinating, lashing out at anyone they encountered. Most would starve to death or be killed by those they attacked in the first month after the fall. The destruction of the Great Spire was not originally the plan for Minerva, but as the nobles fell back into successfully more fortified defenses, it became a last resort to fully topple Hive's leadership. As a consequence, the massive steel in rockcrete damaged the structure of Perklon and collapsed its elevator shafts, the dome cave-in killing much of the inhabitants of the dome proper. By sheer luck, the air circulators, which were of the highest quality due to the large number of corpse starch farms located in the catacombs, held out, and while there was no power, there was air and water enough to survive, at least for a time. Attrition helped. The survivors became accustomed to moving slowly and quietly, because at any moment an opponent could be within striking distance. The darkness was both shield and trap. Sleeping was about finding the hard-to-reach crevices, but finding one was just as dangerous as falling asleep, should you disturb someone already squirreled away there. The violence was swift, ugly, destructive. The numbers dwindled. Then they emerged. A few months had passed since the collapse, and in that time the helots and masters of the corpse grinder clans had finally freed themselves from the tombs that their farms had become. Vast networks of tunnels full of corpses and various fungi and algae growing on them, producing the raw ingredients of most of the staple foods that the hive depended on, they sat undisturbed on a treasure trove of precious nutrients. And instead, the corpse grinders had turned on each other, accustomed to fresh meat, and refused to eat any other than that which they'd cut from the bone themselves. They had brutalized each other and consumed the weakest in fits of blinding fury. The victors set about opening the enormous vault doors protecting their network, and spilled out into an already hellish war of attrition in the tunnels. Myra wasn't about to be someone's dinner. The Escher ganger had killed, she'd scavenged, she had a hidden place that no one else had found yet, and she was quiet. God Emperor, she was quiet. A graceful creature. That was how she'd survived as long as she had. Silence and caution. The corpse grinders had been the latest terror to fill her world, but she had an advantage. The slavering morons were loud as an engine, shouting prayers to their beloved lord of skin and sinew. But worst of all, they had batteries. They had fuel. Their supplies were far greater and of higher quality than anyone living in the tunnels. The hivers that remained had to find better and better hiding places, but most would die soon. Not Myra, though. She was cautious. She'd been stashing food away, using the relative safety of the crevice that she'd found to sneak up on those who thought themselves safe. She didn't revel in killing these strangers, but a few bad experiences when the lights first went out had driven her deep into paranoia. She felt a creeping desire in the back of her head to keep the bodies too, to clean and cure the meats, so that she'd have an option if she truly got desperate. But the thought sickened her and she put it out of her mind every time, dragging the bodies a decent distance away to ensure that they didn't give away her location. When the corpse grinders first came, Myra resolved not to venture out again for fear of the risk of encountering the blood-crazed fools, gibbering to themselves about their hunger and the flesh and the skins. She wondered why they were suddenly wandering the corridors, where they were getting their power from for their glow globes, whether there was enough left in the tunnels to satisfy them. She hid out for days, observing their patterns. She had to venture out every few days in search of water. Her food was mostly preserved, offering little hydration, so she made a trip with a few salvaged canteens to a pipe with an illegal spigot installed. She'd used the pipe for years before the fall had even happened, and as far as she knew, no one else living even knew it was there. She'd wait carefully for the daily patrols to pass, timing her exit from her hiding spot. She began filling her first canteen and then a second, and eventually filling a fifth. On her sixth and final bottle, she tried to turn the knob of the water, and the knob came off in her hand, the metal brittle from wear. The water wouldn't turn off. She knew she had a problem. The rush of water, the gradual expanding puddle from the pipe would lead anyone who was thirsty to her secret water source. The area around her home. She stowed her bottles and panicked, turning to run, but already hearing the thud of footsteps. Patrol shouldn't be returning this early, she thought. She was trapped. She scaled up the side of the wall in the water room, pulling a small tool from her belt to open a vent, and slipping inside only moments before the hulking frame of one of the countless corpse grinders filled the doorway. He walked in, raising his glow globe high to cast light all around. Scanning for any sign of life, finding nothing, he walked over to the spigot, lifted his mask, and drank. Peeking through the cracks in the vent, Myra saw a man's face, strange symbols carved into his flesh, in patterns. In a way, the mask was less horrifying than the figure before her. She heard a shout in the distance, and the corpse grinder barked a reply, "Water, but no meat," and walked out of the room. She wanted to follow, to keep listening to their conversation, but she decided to crawl through the vents in the hopes of getting closer to home without risking being discovered. She knew the direction to head, and having lived in the darkness for months, she knew well how to go and eventually find an opening a few hundred feet from her hideaway. She made a mental note about the vents being a better way to avoid the grinders in the future before heading down to her camp, wondering how much longer her luck would hold. The next time she needed water, she took the vent, hoping the water source would still be available. And while the liquid still gushed, there was also the heavy breathing of a corpse grinder left to guard the water source. Any coming here for respite would find themselves cut down before they'd even knew what hit them. She retreated back to her hole. She'd have to find water again soon, or none of this would matter. As she fitfully slept, she was suddenly awoken by a distant rumble, a pop, pop, pop of explosions. She sat up and felt the ground itself shake. Shockwaves from some kind of explosion were rippling through her tunnel. She didn't know why, but she felt the urge to grab her pack and run. And having survived on instinct this long, she took off. Not a moment too soon, it turned out, as the hole that she had called a home for months collapsed from the hive quake, sending Rumble tumbling down. She had lost her greatest asset. She was in trouble. She checked the vent for damage, and it appeared to be intact. She crawled in and began to explore the pathways leading away from the water source. She was barely small enough to fit, and she worried about turning in the wrong direction and getting herself stuck. But she was able to move around in relative peace here. The grinders were too large to fit in the tight confines of the vents. She got a fair distance from her collapsed dome, and then passed out, too exhausted and scared to continue. When she awoke, she started crawling again, hoping upon hope to find a safe place to hole up. Most everyone was dead. Hopefully someone had left behind a stash. She crawled forward then. Without warning, crack! The very vent in which she'd hidden herself became dislodged, tumbling to the ground and knocking the wind out of her. She tried to remain silent, hoped that no one heard, but luck was not on her side, as the corpse grinder's mask peered into the open vent that she sat inside of. She froze. Her last pistol in hand, she was too paralyzed with fear to fire. He shouted, "Fresh meat," and cackled, shoving an arm into the hole to pull her out. And as he grabbed Myra by the hair, she was jolted out of her trance and swiftly brought her stiletto knife into the man's forearm. He recoiled, screamed, and then stiffened, falling to the ground motionless. She crawled out of the ruins of the vent and drove the blade into his neck. The combination of paralytic and anticoagulant poison on the blade had already taken him out of the fight, but this ended him permanently. She found demo charges in a bag on his back, as well as a pickaxe strapped to it. What were they doing? She didn't have time to investigate, though, as the faint glow of light and sound of footfalls told her that they were coming. She ran, blind, down the halls that she'd never been in before, something she had avoided for this whole saga. Her whole survival strategy relied on being in well-known territory, so she could hide so she could move slowly, using surprise as her weapon. Now she was running into a black nothing, pursued by Empress knows how many cannibal murderers. She stumbled, hitting the bulkhead hard and pushing herself up. She saw the room light up from behind from her pursuers. She stifled the urge to look back at the grinders, focusing instead on squinting into the darkness, hoping to avoid any obstacles. She kept one hand on her knife, ready to strike in an instant as if needed, but still with the sheath on, as even a nick would spell her own death. "Come back, mate, we're hungry," echoed the shout of one of her pursuers. The other chuckled in reaction. She didn't know what she was going to do. She hadn't had a drink in a few days, her muscles were already burning, and the footfalls behind her were getting closer. She heard a saw rev, and the rush of fear drove her to run even faster. She was so focused, despite the dark, that she was seeing red. Or wait, was that light? Dim red light was cascading down the hallway. What the hell was that? Boom! The demolition was incredibly close this time. A shockwave sent debris flying into her face. She choked from the dust, but didn't break stride, didn't stop. The sound of metal straining and groaning filled her ears. And suddenly, she was falling again. The explosion had destabilized the bulkhead, and the tunnel collapsed from under her, and she was blind. She hit something with a soft thud, knocking the wind out of her again, and her eyes opened. She witnessed a faint glow, a green shining through the choking clouds of dust. She felt around. She had landed on a large sprawl of glowing mold. As the spores filled her lungs and the strange sticky surface of the mold filled her pores, she felt different. A short time later, or maybe hours, she couldn't be sure, as things were so different now. She rose, standing, rising further, higher. She was not touching anything. She was standing on nothing. Movement. Something was moving in the tunnel above. She didn't even think. Her reaction, an instinct below the level of conscious thought. She tore the figure off the edge of the ruined bulkhead, causing him to plummet to his demise on a sharp piece of rebar. What was that, she wondered. But before she could even consider her actions, she got the scent. No, something less physical. The presence. It was a sense that she was not familiar with, but she followed it, gliding towards the living thing. It ran. Coward, she thought. You didn't consider what it would be like to be hunted?